Between the hills, the stars, the sky, the river so clear, river so clear.
And now, as we deepen into our service this morning, I would like to share with you a message from Reverend Ranwa Hamami, who is a member of the team of people working to strengthen the capacity of Unitarian Universalists to organize for justice and to mobilize power in people for liberation. This team has identified 4 intersectional justice priorities around which to build power. And one of these is a campaign called Uplift Action that organizes around LGBTQIA+, gender and reproductive justice. In her reflection on this priority, Reverend Hamani reminds us that our bodies do not exist in a vacuum. We physically interact with countless structures, systems, and communities each day that impact and are impacted by our flesh, bones, and spirit. For some of us, these interactions are predominantly empowering moments of welcome and respect. And for some of us, we encounter confusion, denial, and outright rejection as our norm. She also reminds us that our faith has a rich history and an ongoing commitment to lifting up the sacredness of all bodies, even and especially when the systems, structures, and communities with which our bodies regularly interact violently try to tell us otherwise. As we remind ourselves of the miracle of our individual and collective bodies, let us find ways to embody for ourselves some of the most essential truths of our shared faith. May our private and shared rituals reflect love's teachings that all bodies are sacred, all bodies are worthy of the particular care and resources they need to thrive, and all bodies are connected to systems, structures, and communities that they can reshape into life-affirming and liberatory reflections of love. May we remember and live into the values of our faith, embodying our collective power as we create communities of care, affirmation, and celebration. And now we join Unitarians and Unitarian Universalists all over the world in lighting our chalice. And I'm inviting Katie to come forward to light the chalice, which is a symbol of the spark of life in each of us. If you're joining us on Zoom and have your chalice with you, go ahead and turn on your video to share while we light them. We are in good company. Our chalice lighting words are "Seek for the Spirit" by Elizabeth M. Strong. Seek for the spirit of life that is within you, that you might know more fully its power and strength. Seek for the spirit of life that surrounds you, that you might know more fully its connection to you. Seek for the spirit of life that is within others, that you might enter more fully into the community that embraces us this day and every day. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Katie Christensen is the State Director for Planned Parenthood in North Dakota. She has a passion for sex education and raising healthy, informed kids and teens free from shame and guilt. Katie was elected to the Fargo Board of Education in June and is the mother of 2 teen boys. She is engaged to be married to a wonderful human in August and loves to be outside and to ski, hike, camp, and bike. Please join me in welcoming back Katie Christensen.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me here today. As Mary mentioned, my name is Katie Christensen and my pronouns are she, her. I want to share that I am also a member of the Unitarian Universalist Church in Fargo-Moorhead. So it is always a joy to be able to share this space here with other UUs in the state of North Dakota. So as was mentioned in my introduction, my passion is really sex education. And that is what led me to seek a job at Planned Parenthood. It's brought me to this church a few times over the last 10 years to work with youth and work with adults and work with parents. This desire to be a better sex educator really pushed me into spaces to learn more about reproductive justice, which is why I'm here today. So to affirm with other Unitarian Universalists our shared commitment to building a world in which all people can make decisions about their bodies, their health, and their families in safe and thriving communities. So before we jump into this too far, I want to acknowledge that my own values and attitudes towards these ideals have changed over time. So when I think about my own shifts and changes, I think of Dr. Maya Angelou's quote, "Do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better." So before we jump into this too much, I want to give a moment for you to maybe reflect on your own attitudes and values, and if they have shifted over time, and if they have, how so, or why, or what inspired that. In terms of reproductive justice, this is a really big topic, and I'm going to delve into some different parts of it. But for this particular question, I really do want you to focus on abortion. That's a hot topic right now. A lot has changed in the past year in terms of access to abortion, the legality of abortion, who can access it, who can't, who gets to make the decisions about whether a person can or can't access abortion. So that's what I want you to think about. So what I'm going to ask you to do is think back to maybe like your adolescent self or young adulthood, okay? So think of yourself as an adolescent or a young adult. Think about the values that you held about abortion at that time. And I want you to put yourself in one of three camps, okay? Camp number one is my values today are the same as they were then. So adolescent you and current you, those values and attitudes are about the same as they are right now. Camp two is there have been some shifts. Camp three is there have been dramatic shifts. Like I'm a very, very different person about this topic than I was at that stage in my life. So what I am asking, what I'm going to do, if you feel comfortable, is just raise your hand. Okay, so I'm going to be like camp one, camp two, camp three. And then I would like to hear, if people are comfortable, if you are in camp two or three, what is it that made that change? So how many of you would say that you're in camp one? You're basically the same. Those values and attitudes that you had about abortion then, about the same as now. Okay. How many are in camp two? There have been shifts and changes. Okay. And how many people are in camp three? There have been dramatic shifts and changes. Okay, so we have actually quite the spectrum in here of ones, twos, and threes. So I'm curious, if you are a two or a three, would you be willing to share why it is that you shifted? What maybe inspired that shift or change? And you can either like say it and then I can repeat it into the mic, or you could take a mic to someone. I don't know how you like to do things. The first one, okay. Oh, okay. So would somebody be willing to share if you're in camp two or three? Yeah, okay, go ahead. Okay, so learning more about science and just the realities of life. Just realities, okay, thank you. Other reasons about what inspired that change? You had 3 daughters, okay. All right, 3 daughters, yeah. Other thoughts of what inspired that change? Too many ignorant people in science? Okay. Any other thoughts? Yeah. 3 miscarriages, so personal experiences. Personal experiences. Okay, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So what I would like to do today, we're going to talk about reproductive justice, and we're going to talk about the UU principles and how those things align and really support and work with each other. Before I delve into reproductive justice, I do want to take a look at the difference between reproductive rights and reproductive justice, because they are different. They are not interchangeable terms. And the UUA has made a commitment to reproductive justice, not just reproductive rights, but actually reproductive justice. So a right basically refers to a legal protection that we have. It can be a protection to make a certain decision. It can be a protection to access certain services. It can be a protection to make certain decisions or participate in something. So for instance, in 1920, the 19th Amendment legally guaranteed American women the right to vote. That was a right that, we, as if you are a woman, you got that in 1920. Way to go. All right. In 1965, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution of the United States protects the liberty of married couples at the time, to buy and use birth control without government restriction. So prior to that, the government could actually restrict you from purchasing and using birth control. But the Supreme Court was like, nope, you actually have a right to this. We can't infringe on that. Although notice it does actually say married people. So that changed with time a little more. 1973, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution of the United States in general protects a person's right to access an abortion. As we know, this was overturned in June of 2022. So those are rights. They're protected rights. Just because we have a right doesn't necessarily mean that we have access to it. And that is where justice comes into play. You might have the right to vote, but if you don't have a way to get yourself to the polling place, is it accessible? You might have a right to vote, but if you cannot speak or read English and your ballot is in English, it might be difficult to access that. And that's why we see a lot of laws about early voting and mail-in ballots, to try to make sure that we can all access voting in one way or another. You might have the right to birth control, but what if your health insurance does not cover that cost? Maybe you don't have the money to go, you then have to pay out of pocket to go and access this birth control. So the right is there, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee you accessibility. And that's the same thing with abortion. And this was the case prior to Roe v. Wade being overturned. You have the right, we had the right to abortion, but if you live 5 hours from the nearest abortion clinic, you have to have childcare. If you have children, you might have to have a job that lets you take time off work. You might have to secure those funds in order to access that abortion. So we have rights, but when we look at reproductive justice, we're really looking at this broader picture of, do we have access to actually exercise these rights? So that's where reproductive justice comes into play. So reproductive justice is a framework that was created by women of color that combines the fields of reproductive rights, social justice, and human rights. It is grounded in the experiences, values, priorities, and leadership of women of color. And I want to be very clear that this came through a group of women of color, because a lot of white women could exercise these rights. A lot of women, a lot of white women, when we were granted these rights, we could also access the services. But we know that there are pockets of communities that have a more difficult time actually exercising that right and accessing the services. So reproductive justice relies on 4 principles: the right to have children, the right to not have children, the right to raise our children in safe and healthy environments, and the right to health and self-determination regarding their bodies and sexuality, free from oppression and shame. So those are the 4 main principles. So if we think about what impacts these rights, what impacts our ability to have children or to prevent or delay having children, what impacts our ability to raise our kids in a safe and healthy environment, what impacts our ability to have that right to health and self-determination regarding our bodies. So think about things: the sex education you received, whether you have access to birth control and abortion, do you have the ability to stay in or leave a healthy or unhealthy relationship? Do you have access to parental leave if you do have children? Do you have access to affordable quality childcare if you are parenting? There's all these different factors that play into those rights. So I want to point out a few key points that if we as UUs want to say that we support reproductive justice, if we want to work through a reproductive justice lens, there's a couple key points we want to keep in mind. We want to talk about and acknowledge the impact of our own personal identities on our viewpoints and actions. Okay, so that's step number one. So think about your race, your gender identity, your sexual orientation, your wealth, all of these things that contribute to who you are, they impact your viewpoints and your actions when it comes to reproductive justice. So for instance, a white cisgender woman has likely had drastically different experiences with the healthcare system than cisgender women of color and transgender individuals. There's an article that I recently read. It was published in 2020 by BCM Contraception and Reproductive Medicine that reviewed the unintended pregnancy rates among minority women. And this review found that attitudes and norms regarding birth control in minority groups are different than white groups of people. So multiple studies have unfortunately demonstrated that African American and Latina women from low socioeconomic backgrounds have been strongly encouraged by providers to limit their family size. They've been pressured to start contraception or birth control, even when they don't want to. And they have actually been encouraged at higher rates to even seek out tubal sterilization, like permanent sterilization. So if you add this on top of the harmful history that we have in the United States of forced sterilization, which is an unethical practice that targeted Latina and Indigenous women, you can see where these roots of distrust, where they are. So white women go into a clinic, we get education. A woman of color goes into a clinic, she gets coercion. So very different experiences with the healthcare system. So in order to successfully change culture, we must be open to our own growth and really change ourselves. So we have to acknowledge that our own identities influence our experiences when it comes to reproductive healthcare, reproductive justice, the healthcare system in general. The other thing I want to point out when we're looking through the reproductive justice lens is that we need to really focus on and center marginalized individuals. So if there is a limitation or a restriction of some type, a ban, who carries that burden? Who is the one that is harmed by this and who carries the burden of this? So again, I'm going to use an example here about abortion. Again, there is a bill in the North Dakota State Legislature right now that aims to ban abortion in nearly all cases in North Dakota. So when we look at these different bills that are popping up around the country, we really want to look at who is it that's going to be most impacted and who is it that's going to have to carry this burden. So we know, I was looking into some information about this, we know that in the United States, about 90% of Americans support access to abortion in at least some circumstances. So it might actually be really, really limited, but in some circumstances, it's really only about 8 to 10% of the population that says abortion should never, ever be accessible. So most people have at least some exceptions for when they think an abortion should be available. 70% of Americans feel that abortion should be legal in most cases. So about 70% of people think that we should have some amount of access to it. But what we see in these numbers when we poll people is that people tend to express discomfort as the pregnancy progresses. So pregnancy is divided into 3 trimesters. Most people are comfortable with abortions in that first trimester. So that's gestation up to about 12 weeks of pregnancy. And we actually see that 93% of abortions take place in that first trimester. But you see people become more uncomfortable when we're talking about abortions that happen in the second trimester. So when we start looking at maybe week 14, 15, 16, 17, people get a little bit more uncomfortable. And you'll see that throughout states. You'll see a 12-week ban or a 16-week ban or a 20-week ban. But let's look at this now. What does the data and the research tell us about this? So 93% of abortions happen in that first trimester. So let's look at those 6% of people. Why are they seeking out abortions in the second trimester instead of the first trimester? Studies show that most of these women needed time to secure the money. They didn't have the money. they couldn't get an abortion in the first trimester. They had to save their own money. They had to ask friends or family members to help them pay for it. They had to find an abortion fund that would help them pay for things, or maybe they didn't know they were pregnant. They didn't find out until they were farther along in that first trimester, and they didn't have time to make those arrangements. So when we put something like a 12-week ban, who are we harming? Who's carrying that burden? The people that don't have money, the people that don't have the funds and the resources to seek out that abortion sooner. So that's what I want us to do when we look at these different laws and these different bans. Who is the person who's going to have to carry those burdens, and why? Why is that? And we actually see that. I mean, even before Roe v. Wade fell, we saw that people who have money, people who have access to childcare, people who can take time off work, can still access abortion. And that will continue today, even with Roe v. Wade gone. If you have money and resources, you can get on an airplane and fly to a city that provides abortion. You can drive 5 hours and get a hotel room and get an abortion. If you are low income, if you live in a rural community, if you are a young person, or if you are a person of color, you are at a significantly higher risk of not being able to access those resources. Okay, so that is what it looks like when we center the marginalized individuals who will carry these burdens. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is kind of delve into a little bit more reproductive justice and our UU principles, and how are these things kind of playing out in our state. So we do know that a reproductive justice principle is the right to not have children. In my mind, this is undeniably linked to our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. If you have a uterus, you are not simply a vessel. You are not a vessel that has to procreate. You don't have to use your uterus to produce a child if you do not want to. Pregnancy is not a health neutral experience. Carries risks. And it's actually terrifying to me that we have a United States Supreme Court justice right now that, when discussing the legality of abortion, asked whether adoption laws could eliminate the burden of abortion seekers. So implying that you don't need to have an abortion, you can just place the baby up for adoption. But implying that this is some type of neutral experience for a person with a uterus. Pregnancy carries risks. A pregnant person has a significantly higher risk of blood clots, of seizures, of mortality, of problems with blood pressure than a non-pregnant person. So when you're denying somebody access to abortion, you're basically forcing them to take on these risks that they do not want to have. In the United States right now, our maternal mortality rates are going up. They're going up. So maternal mortality is defined as death of a pregnant person or a person within 1 year of giving birth. Our maternal mortality rates in the US are 3 times higher than what they are in Canada. They are 4 times higher than what they are in Scandinavian countries. And it should come as no surprise that there is a disparity between white women and women of color. So women of color, again, will be carrying this heavier burden of facing higher rates of maternal mortality, especially when they are forced to carry a pregnancy that they don't want to have. We, as UUs, we believe in justice and equity and compassion in all human relations. That current bill that I mentioned, Senate Bill 2150, it has an exception for rape and incest. However, the abortion needs to be obtained within the first 6 weeks of pregnancy. Do you know when a pregnancy test will show a positive result? At what point in time in gestation, if somebody pees on that stick, is it going to show a positive? Does anybody know the answer to that? Yeah, it's like the absolute earliest is around 5 weeks. So if you have a person who has experienced like a severe violation to their bodily autonomy, and now we expect them to find a birth control test, to find a pregnancy test, to seek this out, get a positive result, and then access that abortion, this is useless. I actually think this is worse than actually having a ban on abortion for rape and incest, because it makes it look like we have an exception, and we don't. It's completely inaccessible. So imagine you have a 13, 14, 15-year-old person who becomes pregnant because of incest. How long will it take that person to even come forward with that, where they can find a safe place to disclose this? And then especially if they're pregnant, there's no way. I mean, if they come forward and they're 8 weeks pregnant, 10 weeks pregnant, 12 weeks pregnant, our lawmakers right now are okay with forcing that person to continue the pregnancy or drive out of state to get an abortion. That's the situation. Where is the compassion? Where is the compassion in that? I see no compassion or justice for that individual. A couple other things I want to mention really briefly, because I do want to leave some time for question and answer, is in terms of those reproductive justice principles, we also see in here the right to health and self-determination regarding our bodies and sexuality free of oppression and shame. The state of North Dakota has something called Alternatives to Abortion. Not sure if you're familiar with that, but it's a program that they put, they're actually going to put $1.6 million into this program. It already exists, but that's the funding level that they're looking to do. They are programs that exist throughout the state that basically encourage people to continue with a pregnancy instead of seeking an abortion. I will say some of the recipients of these funds are valid, legitimate institutions that have licensed staff and they have decent policies, but there are actually a lot of centers that I would say they don't. They're basically fake clinics. They share inaccurate information about abortion. They refuse to provide information about birth control. And I feel like this is a really strong violation of our fourth principle, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, because there is a maternity center, a maternity home in Fargo. It's called the Perry Center. It's a maternity home. It's like a shelter for a pregnant person. And it actually says on the website under their frequently asked questions section, if you are going to use their shelter, they say, we just ask that you are willing to explore who Jesus is and how that impacts your life by attending one church service per week, participating in a Bible study, and through one-on-one discipleship. I think as UUs, we firmly believe that pregnant people deserve shelter. If somebody wants shelter, they deserve that. And I'm totally fine with using state funds to do that. I do not think that person should have to attend one-on-one discipleship in exchange for shelter. And that's actually the way that funding is working. The funding can go to religious entities. And if religious entities take these funds, there are no limitations on their use of their religious icons, symbols, or scripture. They're allowed to put that on those state-funded materials for this program. So 2 other things, and then I'll finish up here. In reproductive justice, we do see the right to raise our children in safe and healthy environments. In terms of UU principles, we are committed to building communities of peace, liberty, and justice. So let's talk for a minute about the leading cause of injuries and death to children. Does anybody have any idea what the leading cause of injury and death are to children? What? Yeah, firearms. Firearm-related incidents. Number 2 is car accidents. What I can tell you right now is it's not books. Okay, it's not books. It's not books. I've got some books over there. They've never hurt anyone. They've never hurt a child. It's not gender affirming healthcare. It's not transgender people using one bathroom or the other. But when you listen to our lawmakers talk, that's all they talk about. They want to ban books in libraries to protect kids. They want to ban minors from accessing gender affirming care to protect them. And so there's this disconnect. I mean, like, where are they getting their information? I mean, I am very, very thankful that we have this principle, that we are all on this path for truth and meaning, that we have this right to seek out truth and meaning in our lives. And for me, that is what led to my shifts in how I understand this work. I used to think that teen pregnancy was a consequence of irresponsibility. I thought that for a long time. And then I learned that the United States has one of the highest teen pregnancy rates among wealthy nations in the world. I learned that our rate of unintended pregnancy in the US is just around 50%. That is huge, considering how effective birth control is and how effective sex ed is. I learned that our sex ed programs are woefully inadequate. I used to think that abortion caused emotional and physical pain. And then I learned that 95% of abortion patients do not regret their abortion. I learned that abortion is a safe and medical procedure, significantly safer than pregnancy. And I actually learned that people facing unintended pregnancy who want an abortion but cannot seek it, typically for some rule within a town, like they don't have the money to get there, the state has a weird law, they actually have higher rates of preeclampsia and hemorrhaging. So their bodies are actually being put at risk. I used to think that a person seeking an abortion was not taking responsibility for their actions. I actually thought that decades ago. But I learned that when people want to seek an abortion and they can't, they report higher levels of household poverty, they express concerns about not having money for food, housing, and transportation. They have increased debt. They're more likely to raise children alone. They're more likely to experience physical violence from the partner involved in the pregnancy that they could not get away from because now they have a child with that person. They're more likely to have complications during their pregnancy. So in fact, that person trying to get the abortion was making an incredibly responsible decision for themselves and for their children. And so I would say that we here as UUs, we are all part of this interdependent web of existence, and I am not okay with these outcomes, not at all. I am open to questions. That was heavy, I'm really sorry. Yeah, it feels heavy, but I did want to give time for questions.
I don't exactly have a question. I want to tell you a story.
Sure.
Our son did everything right. He went to school, he got married, they waited till they were financially stable. He and his wife decided to have a kid. In 20 weeks, they went for an ultrasound and discovered that their son had unsurvivable birth defects, a really bad case of spina bifida. Fortunately, they were living in a state where it was legal to get an abortion, and they went and had one. They have since had 2 healthy children. But I looked up some statistics at the time, and if our daughter-in-law had been forced to carry that child to term, her chances of dying were roughly 15 times as high as from having an abortion at 20 weeks. There was no way their child was going to live anyhow. So why should our daughter-in-law have to risk her life to carry a child that could not live? Abortion should be available up to 22 weeks in case that you find out at that ultrasound that your child cannot live.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I want to echo that is an example of why we cannot legislate abortion. So what tends to happen sometimes in states that maybe do have like a 20-week ban, you'll get a person at 19 and a half weeks that finds out that their fetus has this diagnosis. So not only are they faced with this heart-wrenching, horrific news, they've got 5 days to make a decision or go out of state. So you're putting burdens on people who are already in utterly heartbreaking situations. There any other questions?
Not a question, but part of my experience. I grew up very conservative Christian, pastor's daughter, and am definitely not anymore. And well, still pastor's daughter, but yeah.
Right.
But one of the things that I didn't learn until I was involved in birth work, I'm also a doula, and was that a D&C is the same procedure as an abortion.
Yeah.
And I was taught as a child and a teen that it's this horrific thing and they tear up your insides. And yes, there are risks, and an ultrasound guided D&C is much safer. But I was purposely told misinformation that I didn't realize was false until I was in my 30s, had 5 pregnancies, and was starting to research more and going, oh crap.
Yeah, abortion is a very, very safe, it's a very safe procedure. In some situations, it's life-saving, and in some situations, it actually preserves someone's fertility. Like if there is an abnormality within the uterus or the fetus that could cause the uterus to damage or rupture, an abortion is gonna actually protect that uterus so that a person can have a future healthy pregnancy. So in some situations, it actually protects a person's ability to have children. So how about one more, and then I think we're probably
So in 2150, originally, I think the exceptions were structured almost as affirmative defenses. And now it looks like they've kind of walked that back. Do you know how that process of change from affirmative defense to just prohibition?
Yeah, I can explain that actually really quickly. So affirmative defense was in the trigger ban. So in I think it was 2007, the North Dakota State Legislature passed a law that said if Roe v. Wade ever goes away, abortion will immediately become illegal in North Dakota. And in there, they had affirmative defense. So what they said in there was that an abortion could be if anybody in the state performed an abortion, it was automatically illegal and you would face criminal charges. However, affirmative defense means if the abortion was provided to save the life of the pregnant person or because of rape or incest, you, doctor, can go to a court and prove your innocence. So affirmative defense is basically guilty until proven innocent. So when Roe v. Wade fell, and this law was trying to be implemented here, the state lawmakers worked with a few doctors and a few groups to be like, okay, we should probably get rid of affirmative defense. Like, this isn't really great for our medical community. So they came up with Senate Bill 2150. I would prefer that they would be like, hey, let's get rid of the trigger ban law and allow people to access safe and legal abortion. So that's how 2150 came about, was to try to get rid of that affirmative defense. But it's still an abortion ban. It's just doing it through different mechanisms.
And now let's extinguish our chalice with these words by Reverend Karen G. Johnston, who's a settled minister in New Jersey, the Unitarian Society in New Jersey. These bodies, we Unitarian Universalists, who have long been known to be a bit too much in our heads, have been moving towards a more authentic recognition of our bodies, a more genuine relationship with our bodies and in our bodies. Hallelujah and blessed be. These bodies are homes. These bodies our being. These bodies without which we can neither have inherent worth nor recognize it in others. These bodies without which we cannot experience the interdependent web of all existence, for it is through our bodies that we are part of that self-same web. Let us pledge ourselves, the whole of ourselves, to the great collective liberation of all bodies. Let us pledge ourselves, the whole of ourselves, to do all that we can to protect against gendered violence against all bodies, known and unknown, near and far, stranger or friend. Let us pledge ourselves, the whole of ourselves, to inhabit these bodies, to honor these bodies, to celebrate these bodies, to defend these bodies. So be it. See to it. Amen.
And the world will be a better place, and the world will be a better place for you and me. Just wait and see. Another day goes by and see the children cry. Put a love in your heart. Take a good look around. If you're looking down, put a little love in your heart. And the world will be a better place, and the world will be a better place.